you very much. And thank you everyone for coming along to hear about Christopher Hill. The talk is really drawn from a book which I published in February, and I haven't really had time for any new thoughts. So I felt a little bit concerned that some of you may have read the book. So I'm not actually going to try and summarize the book, but I'm going to try and talk about some of its central themes. And try not to get too bogged down in the detail. So first, Steve, if I could have the next slide. For those of you who don't know, this is Christopher Hill's bare bones biography. He was born in 1912 in York, the son of a very prosperous solicitor. But he was the first of his family to go to university. In 1931, he went to Balliol College on a Brackenbury scholarship, which is the highest admissions honour that Balliol can give. He graduated with a stellar degree in 1934, winning a university prize for a dissertation, and was elected to a fellowship at All Souls College, which he held for 2 years. He pretty much despised All Souls, I have to say, particularly for its privilege. But in the 30s, it was, although it had a smattering of liberals, it was also marked by the presence of some fiercely reactionary figures. And All Souls stood in Oxford College politics for appeasement, whereas Balliol stood for rearmament, and he was very much more on the Balliol side as an undergraduate and in the immediate aftermath. So he said in later interviews, I'm sure he wasn't entirely serious about it, but he said the main thing that All Souls gave him was the opportunity to visit the USSR, which he did in 1935 and 1936. He'd become a Marxist while an undergraduate in a process that's a little unclear, but I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. But he was a Marxist by 1934, but he wasn't a member of the party until 1936. So one of the things in the book that I try to do is distinguish his intellectual Marxism from the political strategy of membership of the CPGB. And the visit to the USSR was particularly important in his decision to join the CPGB, which he did in 1936. The first special branch record of him comes from 1935. He stepped off a boat from the USSR at Harwich, and a special branch officer thought he looked like a communist and searched his luggage without finding anything incriminating. But it's the first entry in his Secret Service, the file that the Secret Service kept on him then for more or less 27 years. They followed him. So he joined the CPGB in 1936. That was a political strategy, which I'll talk about again in a little bit of detail. He then went to University College, Cardiff for 2 years, professing a view that he didn't really want to be an academic, although at this distance in time, that doesn't quite ring true. But he tried to be the BBC's parliamentary correspondent, and he'd done some work for the Fabians in the research department. So he had flirted with non-academic but politically engaged work. But he went to University College for 2 years, where he was well thought of. But he said in his own recollections of that period that he spent a lot of his time in social activism, and particularly with Basque refugees, refugee children housed at Caerleon. He returned to Balliol in 1938 and stayed there until his retirement in 1978. So this visit to the USSR and to Cardiff apart, he spent basically his adult life in Balliol College. In 1939 to 1941, he had an affair with Sheila Grant Duff. I wouldn't normally, of course, note these things, but it's an invaluable body of love letters that Sheila kept. Hill's letters to Sheila have all been kept. And he talks about a lot of things, about love and authenticity, about the coming of the war, about his attitude to the war, about Soviet politics in the war and in the early years of the war, and so on. So the affair with Sheila Grant Duff is important to the biographer, if not to the biography. I don't know quite how important it remained to him after those 2 very intense years. He did 5 years of military service, initially training as an infantry officer. He signed up to join the intelligence services, but he was never given a job in intelligence. And at one time, it looked like he was going to have an infantry command, which he did in Devon. He was had an initial infantry command in Devon in 1940. But he then moved to the War Office, where he did mainly post-war planning and cultural liaison work down to 1945. In 1944, he married Inez Waugh, a marriage that lasted until 1953, and they had 1 child together who died in the 1980s. They divorced in 1953. It was a blow to Christopher, but it was a reasonably amicable divorce. But it was a blow, and of course, it was also socially difficult in Oxford in the 1950s to be divorced, and he nursed some bruises about the attitude of some academics to his divorce in the 1950s. He married Bridget in 1956 and remained married to her until her death in 2002. At that point, rather melancholy end to Robin Briggs's ODNB entry for Hill. When Bridget died, Christopher had such advanced dementia that Briggs thought that perhaps he didn't know that Bridget had died. His dementia had proceeded to such a point, and he died a year later in a care home in Chipping Norton. Some other key elements of his career, though: he resigned from the CPGB, that should say, in 1957, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Not over Hungary, but over the party's response to Hungary. And the Secret Service file on him was closed in 1962. The Secret Service lost interest in him in 1962. That year, he was elected to give the Ford Lectures in Oxford, which certainly then were regarded as one of the highest accolades a British historian could achieve. So that his departure from the party and the end of Secret Service interest came very close to him coming to the very top of the academic profession. The Ford Lectures in 1962, Fellow of the British Academy in 1965, and Master of Balliol College in the same year. And so he was Master of the College from 1965 to 1978, and then had a long retirement, but the last part of his retirement blighted by rather serious dementia. So that's the life. Steve, if you could move us on. The first thing I want to talk about is how I see Hill, his Marxism and his communism. And for those of you who've read the book, I'm afraid a lot of this is going to be very familiar. But in his personal papers in the 1930s, there's much more on what we might think of as alienation than there is on political economy. He writes in his surviving papers, and I can talk about that it's not necessarily a good guide to what was really going on, but in the papers that survive, there's much more on his worrying away about issues of alienation and personal authenticity. And here I think the critical thing is the thing I didn't mention, that he grew up in a very devout Methodist family, which included philanthropists, missionaries, people really committed to a Methodist view of social improvement. So both an intense religious experience, but also a very socially engaged faith. And he lost that in 1931. And I think a lot of the papers from the 1930s reflect him thinking about what it is that's left of his upbringing after you take the Methodism away. And so a preoccupation of his is with alienation and personal authenticity. And one of the things he said about Methodism was that the form had taken over from the content, that the real spirit of 17th century nonconformity had been the real wine of 19th century, of 17th century nonconformity had become vinegar in the hands of the Victorians who'd been too concerned with forms and respectability and behaviour and had lost sight of the root of the matter. So I think that's part of the context, but his writings and notes about alienation and personal authenticity range much more widely than that. I've got some quotes that I'll put on the slide. So Steve, if you go to the next slide, just so that you can look at this while I'm reading it. Hill wrote, this is from the mid-30s, difficult to date exactly, about the apathy of modern life. There's none of the intellectual activity of Athens and Florence. All is dead, dumb, listless, and bored. Things happen, but we do not mind. They are not for us, not by us. We've got used to inaction now. To keep us alive, we need repeated emotional stimulus. And being a democracy, we get them. Wireless, cinema, jazz, novels, newspapers, sentimentality. These things are not bad in themselves, not very bad, but they exhibit a dreadful state of mental inertia. We do not think it's too hard work. Instead, we buy the Daily Mail. Besides, thinking would get us nowhere. It's a mechanical age. And I think the resonances here of T.S. Eliot and other modernist poetry are quite important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So I have the next slide, Steve. A few years later, I think this letter's from 1940, he wrote to Sheila Grant Duff that there's the world one has to work in to make it better, and two, the person one really is. The social and political world was our inescapable burden. I'm not Oxford any more than you, but it's my political job. But one has to be taught and braced and girded to stand its strain, and one just can't do that unless one has a firm root. That political public role was distinct from the authentic self off stage, a condition in which one can take one's armor off and be a real person, and that is what we can give one another. And there's a lot of people who knew Hill recognize him in this. There's a kind of exterior front. I should say I never met Hill, but a lot of people describe this experience of him, that there is a person withheld, which you don't really encounter when you speak to him. One of the things that was going on in their relationship was that Hill was in love with Sheila. Sheila was sort of in love with Hill, but also in love with another man. And Sheila didn't want to sleep with Hill because she thought it was unacceptable to have these kind of commitments. Hill tried to persuade her that polygamy was okay. This is a chap who 8 years earlier was a devout Methodist in York, writing, "Darling Sheila has problems because she tries to reconcile the situation, our situation, to her nature and certain conventional standards which she wants to accept. As A and B contradict one another, this is difficult." So her problem, in his view, was this conflict between the authentic self and what was expected of people. The truth she would eventually recognize was that she was fundamentally polyandrous in the nicest possible way. As things stood, she was making absurd gestures to B, that is convention, when she says sleeping with me would stop complete concentration on the Baron, their nickname for the other man. Polyandry or sleeping with Hill would not be sordid in these circumstances, a word they used all the time, but in fact being true to herself. If she is polyandrous, why pretend not to be and draw artificial lines? And then on the final slide of quotation, Steve, thanks. So art and sex and modernist poetry, all these things seem to him to be about authenticity at some level. Like sex, art may be perverted to barren ends. Narcissism may have the external trappings without fulfilling the essential function, may be diverted, distracted, impotent, too thin, too inexperienced, too sophisticated. At its best, this is art, has fresh, full, healthy giving. And with that, its own want is satisfied. We give in order to satisfy our own want. And this is the basis of all great art. So there's a lot of writing in this vein in Hill about alienation and personal authenticity, what the external world requires of us and what we're actually like. And he was reading there, as well as Eliot, Auden, and Spender, modernist poetry. And he also, frustratingly for me, he read some Freud, but I'm not sure what. So there's some modernism and psychoanalysis here in this grappling with alienation and personal authority. So Steve, if you could go on to the next slide. So we're back here at what he saw as the crisis of bourgeois culture in the 1930s. And one element of that was how alienated people felt from their true selves and how that was finding expression in art and how people were finding it difficult to conform to standards of conventional behavior. But of course, he was also interested in domestic politics and international relations. There was also a political economy commitment here. I'm just going to read from the book, I'm afraid, because I couldn't do any better than this. Coming of age in the 1930s, Hill saw middle-class certainties collapsing around him in the profound aftershocks of the First World War and the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression revealed the limitations of bourgeois parliamentary government, which seemed simply to be the management committee of the capitalist class. Later, in the 1960s, he recalled that as he went up to Oxford in 1931, it was clear that the labour movement had abandoned the working class. Ramsay MacDonald's government had cut unemployment benefit and imposed means tests. At the same time, Roundtree's survey revealed that 30% of the working class population of York, Hill's hometown, was living below the poverty line. As he put it, the facile optimism of 19th century liberals that life would improve continuously through the application of human reason was given the lie by the trauma of the Great Depression. 20th century liberals seem to have no answers. So that was political economy and the domestic state. Then on the international front, international relations were increasingly chaotic and war seemed to be a permanent feature of a world made up of bourgeois states. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria, the Italian occupation of Abyssinia, and the rise of German fascism all suggested that a world of competing bourgeois states was inevitably and increasingly anarchic. In Hill's view, only the USSR was committed to peace during the 1930s. So that was the crisis of bourgeois culture. It's about bourgeois states and their failures of domestic governance and also anarchy in international relations. Only 15 years after the end of the war to end all wars, it was clear another one was coming, and only a new model state, the USSR, offered any escape from this anarchy. So those are what he diagnosed as elements of a crisis of bourgeois culture. Why did he choose Marxism over the alternatives that he was reading in the 1930s? The key thought for him, I think, is this quote from, I think, Karl Marx. Suddenly, room full of experts, I've suddenly had a doubt. I think it's Marx, wrote, "Man is not merely a social animal, but an animal that can only develop into an individual in society. Societies are what makes us the individuals that we are. There's a dialectic between our individual development and the environment in which we work." And the critical thing is that Marxism can explain alienation and personal authenticity, why bourgeois voters and bourgeois politicians act the way they do, and why bourgeois states act the way they do. It's not a matter of good or evil, it's a matter of the way in which those individuals have been made by bourgeois culture. And his interest here was not just in Eliot's own poetry about the experience of alienation, but something Eliot wrote about a group of poets in the 17th century referred to, for reasons that puzzled me anyway, they're referred to as the metaphysical poets. Eliot argued that the metaphysical poets had been able to express themselves completely and coherently. They were not alienated from their society, and that unified sensibility had subsequently been lost. And that he, Eliot, and his generation of poets were in the same position of trying to restore a unified sensibility after a period in which people had felt alienated from the society around them. And as Hill says, just as the poetry of Eliot and Auden and Spender and so on seem to us to have a direct relationship to the crisis of the 1930s, so it seemed to me perfectly obvious that the fracturing of the sensibility that's in metaphysical poetry had a relation to the crisis of the 17th century. So in the book, I say he's concerned with the crisis of bourgeois culture in the 1930s. The 17th century, and particularly the metaphysical poets, seem to be the crisis that gave rise to bourgeois culture, so that he's interested in the origins of a bourgeois culture, not just the English Revolution. So he read de Sade and Lawrence on sex. He could not find in English literature satisfactory means to express a healthy attitude towards sex. He writes at one point, the only realistic attitudes to sex are the glorification of Lawrence or the fear and disgust of Joyce. Other attitudes are conventional. The romantic conventionalizes glorification. The repressive conventionalizes fear. Shakespeare always fear when not conventionally romantic. So there's a lot of literary writing about the relationship between an individual and their society, and how the fractures evident in their literary work reflect the environment in which they're working. So Marxism offers a way of thinking about that, of course, that bourgeois culture requires things of us that create alienation and create divided hearts, as Cecil Day Lewis called it at one point. Marxism, though, offered a solution not only to personal alienation, but also to the anarchy of the international order. A particular mode of production leads us to imagine roles for ourselves which sustain the economic order, but which are also prisons of our own collective making. That's the personal alienation. But he told Margaret James that thinking about the outbreak of the war in 1939 in terms of good people and bad people and good and evil people was beside the point. War was a product of the system, not the wickedness of particular politicians or people. So it can't be opposed just by goodness. It needs a reform of the system. It's the class structure of a state that determines its foreign policy, not the niceness or otherwise of the individuals in the government or even its advisory department. And whereas Margaret James thought that if individuals act decently, it will produce a decent society, Hill thinks we need social reform to create a decent society within which the decency of all of us is not frustrated, wasted, and sidetracked. And I could go on, but basically, in the international order, the USSR is a model society, a non-bourgeois state which is pursuing peace and sought intervention in Spain when the bourgeois states wouldn't, and so forth. Perhaps that's enough, but this, I think, to summarize this, I think Hill is more interested in Marxist humanism than in Marxist political economy. And in a later interview, he said, I tried to read Capital, but I couldn't get anywhere with it. And I read the more philosophical and historical works. And this is Barbara Epstein's summary of Marxist humanism. What sort of society would be most conducive to human thriving? And I think that's what Hill was primarily interested in and what Marxism did for him. But it did that for him in a way that modernism and psychoanalysis couldn't, with their emphasis only on the individual and a much less emphasis on economy, power, politics, and how they shape individuals. So in all this, he saw the USSR as a model society. He'd become an intellectual Marxist by these means by 1934. What drew him to communism was the USSR. And he went in 1935 and said in a semi-biographical novel, fragment of a novel, it's such a relief to be in a sane country where wages have some connection with work done, where power has no connection with money, where sex is not a matter of rubber shops and lavatory jokes. It was also the only state committed to peace in the 1930s because it was not capitalist and it was democratic. Now here, I'm sure we'll get questions about this in the at the end, but this is what he thought. It's hard to understand why he thought it, because he knew about the purges, he knew about the gulags, and so on. So he'd come to Marxism, I think, basically with this thought that it's an explanation both about the individual and society. The next question he asked himself was what he could do. He engaged in lots of social activism with the Workers' Education Association, with unemployed workers' camps, with the kids in Caerleon, with the Fabians, and so on. And so he was a broadly social activist on progressive causes, but not in a party ideological way. He was not revolutionary. He said in the same biographical fragment from 1935, "What could I do in England? It's no good my going down to the working class and preaching bloody revolution in my Oxford accent." What he thought he could do, rather than party organisation and party activism, was write Marxist history. Perhaps if you could put up the next slide, Steve. He thought that intellectuals had let everyone down in the 1930s. The mind is at the end of its tether, Mr. Wells has told us, and if one of the most courageous of bourgeois intellectuals comes to feel this after a lifetime of struggle against the forces of unreason, what hope is there for less robust thinkers? Two fates seem to await them. Either they cease to attempt to communicate and explain, or they preach irrationalism. And I won't read the rest of that. But he thought Marxism offered a diagnosis, but also a cure, and that by writing Marxist history, he could explain where this crisis of bourgeois culture came from and help shape responses to it. So that writing Marxist history was going to offer a kind of intellectual leadership, which none of these people do. And it's quite a list, isn't it? Tout, Keynes is accepted. James Joyce, Forster, T.S. Eliot, Bertrand Russell, Sartre, Toynbee, they've all let us down, but a Marxist history can help us. And as he wrote to the party leadership, I think in 1949, he wanted to address, quotes, the need for English teachers for a Marxist history of England that would be acceptable to academic historians. So that was his ambition, was that by writing academically acceptable history that explained the past from a Marxist perspective, he would be filling the gap left by this, what he calls here, trahison de clerc, the utter failure of intellectual leadership that he identified in the 1930s. So next slide, please, Steve. So here we are, we're on Hill joining the CPGB in 1936. He came back from Russia and joined the party, convinced that he could serve the cause, not as an activist, although he did do factory gate activism, but his main contribution to the party was going to be writing Marxist history. And in that, he enjoyed the patronage and support of Donna Torr, who's pictured there. It was made easier for him because the party position had changed from when he was an undergraduate. He was turned off Communist Party politics because he thought it was posturing and asking for Bolshevik strategy in a society where Bolshevik strategy was inappropriate. And the switch from class against class to the Popular Front gave him an opening, gave him a party home. So he joined the CPGB really as a Popular Front supporter, building progressive support across a broad left, including cultural work, in order to build support for progressive causes. And as the party committed increasingly to that kind of work in the Popular Front period, it was a more comfortable home for him. So he joined in 57. Joined in 36 because the strategy suited him. He left in 57 because the strategy didn't suit him. He left on the issue of inner party democracy. It was as much the Khrushchev speech and the failure of the party to respond to Khrushchev's identification of the ills of Stalinism. It was as much that as the invasion of Hungary. But he was outraged by censorship of the Daily Worker journalists who knew what was going on in Hungary, but were not allowed to say what was going on in Hungary because of party discipline. The party quite cleverly asked him to join a commission on inner party democracy to talk about internal reform. It was the failure of the party to take his view of freeing up internal party discussion that led him to leave in 1957. And that again makes me think that it's better to think of him as a Marxist humanist, and how Stalinism was constraining his view of Marxism as a liberating ideal. It's better to think of him that way than to think of him as a political economy Marxist who so on, so on. So that's Hill, Marxism and Communism. The rest of it, I hope, is going to be much quicker to get through. I think I've only got 7 minutes left. So the next slide, please, Steve. One interest in Hill for me is that I think he shaped a field in a way that is still true, in that lots of undergraduates still say that they disagree with Christopher Hill. We're still having the argument that Hill started. And lots of writing since the 1980s has been positioned against the Hill view. So I think he shaped a field, becoming very influential in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but he's also shaped the field in a kind of negative integration way since then. So what did he do by way of shaping the field? Well, for those of you who don't know the 17th century, there were 4 periods of crisis, I suppose. There was a civil war, 42 to 46, between Parliament and the Crown, in which it said a greater proportion of the population died than in the First World War, and 20% of the country's urban property was destroyed. An incredibly traumatic experience, but also culturally catastrophic and traumatic. One response to that was to carry through a revolution in 1649, the execution of the king, the abolition of monarchy, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the abolition of the Church of England, as one route to a stable political settlement. And much attention has been paid to that, the revolution, as a way of escaping the horrors of the Civil War. And Hill is associated with a lot of writing about the causes and significance of that revolution. The revolutionary regime only lasted 11 years and was replaced by the restored Stuart monarchy in 1660. And then in 1689, some of the constitutional reforms of the earlier period were finally cemented in a glorious revolution, which entailed the replacement of James II with a more acceptable monarch. So one way of reading all this, and the dominant way of reading it when Hill was learning about this in the 1930s, is to see the progressive achievement of a constitutional monarchy, an excessive response in 1649, a slightly excessive reaction in 1660, and then a balanced and sensible revolution in 1689. One of the key things that emerged in all this evolution towards a stable constitutional monarchy was a breaking of the church's monopoly over religious truth, or at least the tolerance of other forms of Protestant belief and practice. So the big idea that had been attached to this kind of constitutional gradualist view of the 17th century, the big idea that had been attached to it when Hill was a young man was S.R. Gardner, who called it a Puritan revolution, that Puritanism had in it the seeds of voluntarism and a demand for the individual to navigate their own relationship with God and to put their conscience above their membership of a national church. And that because the Constitution was based on a national church and a national church monopoly, this Puritanism destabilized the constitutional settlement and eventually led to a relaxation of the Church of England's hold and also constitutional limits on the monarchy. That's a terribly crude summary of a much more nuanced argument. But what I want to say about it and what Hill was reacting against was idealism. Gardner thought that behind all this lay a new idea, which is the Puritan conscience, the individual Christian conscience, and how sovereign that is against the jurisdiction of any church, and how destabilizing that was for the Constitution. And that idealism was out of fashion in the 1930s, that history progresses because people have better ideas, and that what people say about themselves is what they actually think. A.L. Rouse, writing in 1938 about Hill and Trevor Roper, two people not normally bracketed together, he thought they both had the virtue of challenging idealism. He said, people in general are apt to be so unconscious of what really moves them. So listening to what they say about their actions isn't really an explanation of what they're doing. This is what the younger people think. Indeed, they've come to regard it as a commonplace. So the real problem that Hill saw with Gardner was not that he said religion was important, but that he abstracted religion from everything else and made it a kind of idealist explanation. It's religious ideas that explain everything. The key figure for many of them was Lewis Namier in the 1930s, who'd taken political analysis of the 18th century away from ideology and professed opinion and looked at interests. Whose interests are at work in politics? Namier is usually seen as a conservative figure, but that move in the 30s was popular with the left as well. So what Hill said about all this was that in the history of ideas, environment is more important than heredity. This is all back to Eliot and the metaphysical poets. If you want to understand what a poet writes, you have to understand the society in which they're writing. If you want to understand what a Puritan thinks and what a Puritan believes his ideas force us to do, you have to understand the society in which he's thinking. And what Gardner did not do is place the ideas in their social environments and think about power and all those things. So in a series of books, Hill then argued that the political crisis in the 17th century was related to the emergence of new ideas. The new ideas took hold, not because they were better than the old ideas, but because they fitted better with the material conditions in which people were articulating them. 1940, he published The English Revolution, 1640, which is much cited. I don't think he saw it as the best statement of his views. The Century of Revolution in 1961 related all this political instability to changes in art, music, intellectual life, religious thought, scientific thought. He was writing in 1961 about a whole bourgeois culture and how it and the revolution were connected with one another. The political instabilities related to this emergence of a bourgeois culture. And that is really set an agenda which is still being pursued, I think, by many historians of this period. What exactly is the relationship between these new ideas and their social and political environment? It was not restricted, the influence is not restricted only to Marxists, because this birth of bourgeois culture also appealed to people interested in modernization. Britain was the first democracy, the first mass society. So explaining the British path to modernity was explaining potentially something about everyone's path to modernity. So the rewriting of English history in the 17th century had an appeal much beyond those who were interested only in the 17th century. I've got to really rush through the final two slides. I'm very sorry.
So, take your time. I think you docked a few minutes off because you didn't start till a bit after I'd finished. So just take your time.
Okay. So that's one way of thinking about Hill's oeuvre is as a kind of grand revision of idealism and trying to relate cultural change to other changes, particularly economic and political. But this interest of his between ideas and environment, I think you can see differing emphasis throughout his career. I think most of these things I'm about to talk about, you can see at every point in his career, but I think that there's a differing emphasis. And in the 50s, during his party membership, he wrote much more about the state and political economy. And this came out of the Communist Party Historians Group, the ancestor of your group. And this is David's work, actually. So David will tell me whether I've understood this correctly or not. But it was framed, the Communist Party group was framed around partly Hill's own work, something he'd written, but also the revision of A.L. Morton's history of the People's History of England. Morton's the figure on the right of the screen, in the light of the Marxist economy of Maurice Dobb. And most party members felt in the 50s that Dobb's Marxist political economy should be more firmly the basis for a Marxist understanding of the British past. So Morton had glorified radical tradition and so on, but had not in the first edition paid as much attention to political economy, not least because Dobb hadn't yet written. But in the 50s, I think Hill's work is shaped by that debate within the party about political economy and how capitalism and the needs of capitalism and the development of capitalism are really driving a lot of political and intellectual change. And in that, he was very influenced by Dobb. I didn't find any correspondence between Dobb and Hill, but I found plenty of references that they were mutually, they knew each other, liked each other, and mutually admired each other. After the 50s, though, I think he returns to his more natural territory, which is the intellectual, the products of the human mind in these conflicted times, and he becomes increasingly interested in ideas. Firstly, in the late 50s and early 60s, he wrote about science, reason, and progress. This was obviously a key thing in British culture in the late 50s and 60s, the M1 being seen as the acme of science and so on. And that culminated in a book called The Intellectual Origins of the English Revolution, which included a substantial discussion of early modern science and the growth of empirical science and its relationship to this new bourgeois culture. But he wrote much more widely on science, the application of reason to human affairs. He wrote about history in The Intellectual Origins of the English Revolution and argued for an empirical, rational analysis of the human past as a way of understanding it. And he related all these things to bourgeois culture. So he's becoming much more, or the element of him that's an intellectual historian becomes more visible, I think, in the 1960s. In his time as Balliol, Master of Balliol, he faced the student rebellion. It wasn't terribly spectacular in Oxford by comparison with the LSE or Paris, but it was difficult to be master of an Oxford college in the 60s and the early 70s. In his day job, he upheld decency and convention. That's my political job. That's the armor I have to wear out in the world. But he clearly had a lot of sympathy with personal liberation, and it prompted him, I think, more or less directly, to write The World Turned Upside Down, which came out in 1972 and is a celebration of really radical thought in the 1640s and what he called a revolution that might have overthrown bourgeois culture before bourgeois culture had even triumphed. There was this moment where people repudiated respectability of all sorts, and bourgeois culture may have been defeated before it rose. And I think that clearly bears relationship to his experience in the late 60s and early 70s. Then in the 80s, the years of Thatcher, Labour's repeated drubbing in national elections, he wrote about the experience of defeat and what radicals do when the world has turned against them. And he wrote more about restoration figures than radicals after the Restoration, and how they kept the flame alive and how they made their peace with a world that was no longer going in their direction. So I think all that is about, back to the what can I do? He wanted to write a history that was of use. And what that meant at any particular time was partly a result of the world he was encountering. So in the early 60s, interest in science, 70s, personal liberation, 80s, what do radicals do when they're losing politically? And I think you can see him a stable core of interests, but him trying to bring them to bear in some way on what's going on around him in these four phases. So that's how I think he shaped the field, and his Marxism and his communism, and how at any particular time he was prompted to write in one direction or another, and how we can see broad phases in the expression of his interests. But from the 1980s onwards, Hill's reputation went into a nosedive. I went to university in 1981, and I wasn't really asked to read Hill at all.
Oh.
My brother, 3 years older than me, had read The Century of Revolution at A level. I did not. There's a really rapid falling out of favour in of Hill, and a very rapid rise of critical views of Hill's writing. Now, in the literature and everywhere else, these things have become entangled. The reaction against the academic reaction with Hill has become entangled with discussion of Thatcherism. And in the book, I try and disentangle them. So Hill was a figure in the Thatcher, what we would now call culture wars. The Thatcher governments were particularly interested in cultural renewal and educational reform. Keith Joseph's speech to the Birmingham Conservative Association in 1974 against comprehensive education and in favour of a restoration of educational standards set a tone for the Thatcher government, which culminated in the 1988 Education Act and the introduction of a national curriculum, including a national curriculum in history, which is a more political thing to define than a national curriculum in maths or physics. And the Thatcher government's view of the national curriculum was almost directly counter to Hill's. So Hill was a public figure in criticising this element of the cultural renewal, the educational reform and the national curriculum in particular, but also Mrs. Thatcher's invocation of Victorian values, which he lampooned, really. Hill became a public figure partly because he was an interlocutor with these people, but also because he was championed by Michael Foot, who fancied himself an intellectual and a historian and was dreadfully patronising about Thatcher's ventures in this direction. So Hill was a figure in that. He was a minor figure, but he was definitely a figure. And his last collection of essays contains lots of commentary on the Thatcher government and its education policy. He was also, and I discussed this at length in the book, he was caught up in a kind of mole hunting after the final unmasking of Anthony Blunt. Hill was accused of having been an agent of influence for the Russians of the Soviets in 1944 and 45 when he was working in the War Office on post-war planning and cultural liaison. In the book, I mean, it's a detailed thing, and I suppose I can't really go into it here. I don't think there's much there. And I think the easiest explanation is that Hill wasn't an agent of influence. So for me, the interesting question is why so much attention was paid to that. And I think it's because of this general atmosphere in which there's Hill is a public figure opposing Thatcher's education policy and cultural renewal. There's a reaction against Marxism on the right, but also on the left. Many left figures renounced Marxism in the 80s. And I think there was this conflation of Hill, or too ready belief that a Marxist would have behaved the way that Hill was said to have behaved. But it's also true that part of it was why are people so forgiving of Stalinists, and all that is political. So I think all that is definitely going on in the 80s and is definitely part of the story of Hill's reputation from the 1980s onwards. But that's not the only story. Just as he found fault with Gardner's idealism, a new generation of historians found fault in Hill's what they saw as determinism, deriving people's ideas from their class position or their economic role and so on. So he was accused of that determinism, but also of teleology, saying that history leads in an inevitable direction, and that's implicit in Marxism, as in some other kinds of explanation. Unless you're careful, Marxism becomes teleological, and he was accused of being teleological. And in making his case, particularly, for example, in The World Turned Upside Down, it was said that he had his pre-existing model of explanation and that he lumped people together who happened to say the same thing, but didn't believe the same things at all. Two people who happen to be on the same bus and assuming that they're best of friends. It's lumping people together because at a particular moment they say something that sounds like they're in agreement. Lumping people together. Now, the cause célèbre in all this was a group called the Ranters. Hill had celebrated the Ranters as people who'd thrown off the bourgeois yoke before it was fully on. Revisionists said, when you look, these people don't agree with each other. They're not a group. They don't know each other. Ranter views are, you've lumped people together to produce a composite view which no one actually held, and none of these people knew each other. The Ranters didn't actually exist. A big controversy, but just to make my point that these things were not entirely separable, Kenneth Baker chose the book that criticised Hill on the Ranters as his book of the year in The Observer, as a kind of gesture to the progressives, I think. So it became difficult to disentangle the politics of this from the scholarly criticism. And I think that's what I wanted to do when I wrote the book, was try and, for myself, separate out the politics from the scholarship. What we're left with after revisionism, and this is really summarising 40 years of work in 2 sentences, but the tone of the field has become much more concerned with the war than the revolution, the horror of the war, the pointlessness of it all. Blair Worden, in the best 1-volume summary of all this, concludes, quoting Dryden, "Thy wars brought nothing about. The wars were all entirely futile." So I think after revisionism, there's an emphasis on the trauma, the suffering, and the war, rather than the excitement of the ideas, the revolutionary potential, the new society, and so on. And associated with that is a claim that we can and should understand the past in its own terms. We shouldn't understand the Ranters as proto-Summer of Love hippies. We should understand them for what they were and what they thought of themselves. So the reaction against Hill has broadly taken those forms. And you can see that it's a mixture of kind of academic concern about how to do history, but also a specific concern about how Marxism is not good history. But I do think, for me, my experience anyway in the 80s was that was very difficult to separate from the Hill as a public figure in the Thatcher years. I won't say anything. So just on the final slide, just to summarise it all, Trevor Roper in 1958 on Marxist intellectuals of Hill's generation. I think this is right. He's writing after Hill left the party. Having grown up with depression and unemployment, a crisis in capitalism, the emergence of fascism, they'd felt a moral reaction against the complacent Philistinism of the 1920s and the private aestheticism in which their own predecessors had taken refuge. Trevor Roper most definitely saw it as a moral rather than a political or intellectual reaction. But those whom conscience led in, conscience, if it survived, led out again. Partly it was the shock instilled by Soviet foreign policy, cynicism in Spain, and a pact with the Nazis, but really it was the petty Stalinism of the party bureaucracy. Quoting Trevor Roper, the intellectual tyranny of the stunted hacks. Mr. Christopher Hill, for instance, seems to have had no difficulty in swallowing and defending every act of Stalin. It was the action of these local bosses that finished him. I think that's a fairly good summary of Hill, although I think it's unfair on his relationship with Stalin. But that's the view I set out in the book, and I think it's why Hill is an interesting figure, because there's much more going on here than simply the issue of allegiance in 1642 when the war broke out. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Right, there's a lot to go at there. So we've got time for questions and observations. Nobody's putting their hand up. Oh, yes, somebody very quickly off the mark. Helen Mercer.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you very much indeed. That was really very interesting, and I think I agree with your assessment. I've got a little anecdote, and then I've got a question, if that's okay. The anecdote is this, that my father was somebody called Eric Mercer, who was also in the Communist Party history group and knew Christopher Hill. And just as a sort of bit of an illustration for some of your points really about him, maybe it fits in, maybe it doesn't. He had to ring my father in about, I think it was about the late 80s, early 90s. And they had a long chat. He was ringing him about something else because they had intellectual interests in common. And he ended up by saying, according to my father rather ruefully, "Oh, I'm a good boy now." So it's a little anecdote, which I think sort of fits in with some of what you're saying. I'm not sure. The question I wanted to ask was about him being more influenced by the humanism of Marx and not the political economy side. And I take your point about, the influence of Maurice Dobb as well. And that fits very much with my father's development, I think. But I just wondered how far, in fact, that more emphasis on cultural issues influenced the work of the cultural work of the Communist Party in the 40s and the 50s, and then its impact maybe on the group of communist historians who broke away. Whether you could say something about that.
Yeah, so I think David would probably give you a better answer, actually. I mean, from inside Hill's world, he felt that he was publishing, and he spoke about foreign translations and so on, but he was very disparaging about his effectiveness on party schools. He worked as a tutor for the WEA, but also in party summer schools, and he said he wasn't very good at that. So, and he also said that he changed his writing style because a young activist said, I don't understand all this jargon. So I think he increasingly felt, although he continued very dutifully to hand out leaflets at the Cowley factory gate and so on, I think he felt increasingly kind of ineffective in an activist role, and that what he was doing was a bit removed from the front line of party cultural work. And I'm going to get the dates a little bit wrong, but in 52 or 53, Hill suggested that there should be a party group, historians group for professional, i.e. university employed historians, because their problems were different. They were facing, silent purges and so on. But I think it was also because he felt that was the register in which he ultimately wrote. And that quotation I gave early on, he said it was important to him that the Marxist history he wrote should be academically acceptable. So I think all that put a little bit of distance between him in the end and the cultural work of the party. And there's a very good article by, I didn't really appreciate all this because I had my Hill goggles on. But after the book came out, I read Mark Goldie's essay on Lionel Mumby. And Mumby gives a completely different view of the group and its work and of Hill's significance. And I think there's a whole group of historians who are much more engaged in the activism, and their cultural work is much closer to the activism of the party. And I'm afraid that as a university academic myself, I was probably a bit insensitive to all that in the book and didn't give in that sense, I don't think I got Hill's position in the group quite right, actually. But I'd be interested, we should let other people ask a question, but if you were to email me, I'd be really interested. Say this to everyone, I've offered Balliol to keep emails I get with stories about Hill for deposit in the Balliol archives for the use of future scholars, because I found things out that I didn't know when I wrote the book. So if Helen, you want to do that, or anyone else, I'd be very pleased to keep them and deposit them if you're willing.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I would just interject there that Harry Pollitt was very clear that party intellectuals had to be good at their job, just like other workers had to be good at their job. And when I joined, that was what I was told. Funnily enough, people like E.P. Thompson, who was barely involved in the historians group, actually was one of the most politically active party, sit on the Yorkshire District Committee of the party, and so on. But not everybody was expected to do that. David Morgan. David, you're muted.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike, for this great talk. It's given us a lot to think about to reassess Hill's work. Can I just say that I was at university more or less at the same time as you. You said, did you say 81 or something? I mean, I was at from 80 to 83, and Hill was definitely on the agenda. I was at Bangor, but I was doing literature. My tutor introduced me to Hill. Thomas Corns, who was sort of an authority on Milton. I noticed you didn't mention Milton at all. And another one you didn't mention was Gerard Winstanley. I think one of the books that really interested me most from Hill was a lesser work of his called The Religion of Gerard Winstanley, which came out with the Past and Present. Also, you didn't mention the journal Past and Present, which I think was quite influential for me when I was studying at that time, and I've still continued to subscribe to it all these years. Anyway, Hill came to Bangor in 1980. He delivered a lecture on the English Revolution, why it was a revolution. And he was challenging the revisionists who were coming to the fore then, to say that it wasn't actually a revolution. But I find it a very stimulating talk. And I went on to do research on Winstanley for my BA, because Tom Corns was doing this course on pamphleteers of the 17th century. So he introduced me to all these writers, the Ranters, Cope, and Lilburn, and Gerard Winstanley, of course. And I've always continued to be very interested. I noticed Nigel Smith here, he's written quite a lot about this as well. Anyway, the question I wanted to ask related to literature, because what I found useful about Hill, he wrote about Richardson's Clarissa, he wrote about Marvel, he wrote about, I think, the Bunyan book. Obviously that came much later, but he was still writing about all these authors. And they were very interesting for me to get through my course. and I've never really looked. Well, I don't know if I've looked back. I've still continued to read these books. I'm still very influential. I think the most influential one for me was the one on Winstanley and the one on Milton on the English Revolution, which Hill says that was influenced. Edgell Rickwood wrote an essay in that book on 1940.
Yeah.
Milton, the revolutionary intellectual, and Hill said that Rickwood had said everything that he wanted to say in like 20 pages, whereas Hill wrote a 400-page book expanding on it. So the connections between all these authors, Hill's maintained his contact with all the Marxist historians through past and present, and he still lectured at Mark's house. I mean, I heard Hill lecturing at Mark's house a couple of times in the 80s when I came to London. I think I heard him 3 or 4 times. Anyway, the question was, what do you think of Hill as his method using literature for historical as a resource for historical research?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I say in the book, I hope I say it prominently enough. He was, to my mind, I'm not a very good reader of literary texts, but to my ear, he's a sensitive reader of literary texts, and his reputation survived much better among English scholars than among historians. And one of the lines of critique of him in the 80s, in my neck of the woods, interest in economic and social history, was that he hadn't really done the work with the sources you needed in order to do economic and social history. He'd read a lot of editorials. He'd read newspaper editorials and said this was what was going on in the economy. He hadn't actually looked at particular businesses in the archives and so on. So the Cambridge group where I was doing economic history in a completely different way and not interested in Hill's method. But Hill's response to that and to the revisionists was to say, John Morrell, who taught me, has never read a literary text. I mean, all this stuff about me not using manuscripts, but these people rule themselves out of engaging with the intellectuals of the time by not reading literature. So it's certainly true that he was serious about literature, and I think he did better in the 80s among literary scholars than among historians. And I think some of his literary work has aged better than his history work is generally thought to have aged, and it's a really distinctive feature of his. And I should have mentioned Marlowe, Milton, and the others. One thing I'll say is that his first article was on Marvel, and he wrote it while he was trying to persuade Sheila Grant Duff that they should sleep together, and of course he signed.
We're not really interested in titles at all.
David, just
it's my contribution to literary history is origins of the last.
We need to ask some more people some questions here. Nigel Smith, try it fairly pointed, Mike. Nigel, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. David would be pleased to know that I'm just finishing a huge piece of a Milton edition with Tom Corns this week. I enjoyed that, Michael, and of course your biography. Just to pick up on your point that the experience of the Civil War, is now the preoccupation of the historians. But wouldn't you all? I mean, I'm not going to argue with that, especially not with one of the preeminent historians of the Civil War. But is it not the case that we still care about the ideas that emerged in the 1640s and 50s and trying to understand them better? So republicanism, English republicanism, in its many dimensions, and the religious ideas of alternative ways of having a community or a communion. So in that sense, Hill's legacy survives, even if we're not driven to look at it in quite the same way that he did.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, actually. I mean, I think the political history, very narrowly, the political history is emphasizes the horrors of the war and how it didn't serve the interests of the people. But I think and I think you're right that an interest in intellectual novelty and creativity is alive and well in intellectual and religious and literary scholarship and so on. I think what's been lost is Hill's unifying ambition to try to bring it all together in a coherent story. And there's quite a lot of skepticism about even attempting it. But I mean, you're right. That's a much better way of what you've said is Nigel's right.
Okay.
Thank you. Edward Brightwell. Edward, I can see you.
Can't hear you, Edward. Sorry.
How about now?
Yeah. Yes, there's quite a lot of reverb.
Yeah.
Will this work? Or...
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've recently become, really into early modern Britain as a student, learning about it for the first time. And I encountered Hill's work through kind of doing historiographical studies and trying to go through different opinions. And I wondered where you thought how you thought his work should be viewed today overall.
Well, that's a deceptively difficult question because there's so much of it and he wrote about so many different things. So the one thing I'm very interested in is his ambition to make sense of all this as a kind of total crisis, and why one outcome was the outcome that stuck and why the others failed. And I'm not sure people have really been asking that question, and Hill persistently asked that question, and he offered an answer which is not widely accepted, but actually has some virtues. I think why some settlements didn't work and others proved durable, and also why an essentially conservative war produced such radical thought. So I from my particular neck of the academic woods, that looks all quite important, but I wouldn't really stand behind the detail of Hill's work on a lot of those questions. I think he's been superseded in lots of ways in his answers, but the questions are still very good ones. I think he's, as we've heard, his work on Milton and Bunyan in particular is widely admired, Winstanley too. So in the literary and intellectual field, radical political thought, radical religion and literature, I think he's still better thought of. But more than that, I'd say he's really well worth reading because he's such a sensitive reader, an interesting reader of texts. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a flanneling answer, Edward, because there's so much to talk about. There's 18 books and 70 essays and, Lord knows what. I mean, we could have a whole seminar on Hill and Milton. Well, and it wouldn't be with me as the speaker. So it's hard to answer in a kind of grand way, but I'd say the questions are really good. The ambition is really admirable. And his attention to literary and intellectual texts is distinctive and interesting and important.
Thank you. Jack Middleton. Jack Middleton. Cannot see Jack. Oh no, he's got his hand up. Jack, you're muted, I think. You have to unmute yourself. Unfortunately, I can't do it.
He's in the chat saying he's got technical difficulties.
Okay, right. So we'll move on then to James Crossley.
Thanks, Mike. Just on.
Hi, James.
Hi, Mike. another university anecdote, but I did English and religion in the 90s, and it's interesting to hear Hill's reputation has tanked in history, but he was one of the first person referenced when we did anything to do with English literature, 17th century or theology or whatever of the 17th century. Still very, very strong, held in very high regard. And I wonder if they're also related to this, if there's more continuity with the Communist Party historians group and Marxist humanism, because and the literature question, because they were all, I think probably all the prominent figures were interested in Marxist humanism, Morton emphatically, but they were all interested in literature. And I think there was an anecdote by Eric Hobsbawm or something that it was literature that replaced philosophy for this group of Marxists. If they'd been on the continent, they would have studied philosophy and thought in those kinds of terms. But because they were brought up in the UK, literature took on that role, and that's why they all developed into these kinds of figures.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Hobsbawm says, doesn't he, that literature took the place of philosophy in England because philosophy wasn't taught in the schools. And, that's right. My perspective is, I mean, of course, I was taught in the heart of the revisionist. Cambridge in the 80s was perhaps the most advanced place for revisionism. So perhaps I had an exaggerated view of the power of revisionism in that period.
Yeah, listen. Yeah. Where are we now? David Margolis, I think, you're the next. David, you're muted.
Okay. I just wanted to make one small point, continuing from what James Crosley said. I've found this lecture fascinating, and I thank you, Michael, for doing it. But the part of the drawing of Hill into literary discussion was due to Margot Heinemann making sure that all her students read Hill and constantly propagandizing for the importance of his way of looking at things.
Yeah, the Heinemann papers are quite revealing directly about their relationship, but also how often she was an advocate for him, and including there's a very hostile review of the Milton book by Blair Worden, I think, and Heinemann wrote to the Oxford English faculty saying, if you're going to ask students to read the Worden review, you must also ask them to read Quentin Skinner, who's much kinder. So that's absolutely right, and they go way back, don't they? Heinemann and Hill, an influence from the 50s all the way through, and she stayed in the party and he didn't, but that wasn't a rift between them. I'm certain of that. Yeah.
Is Jack still suffering technical difficulties? Jack?
I hope not. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Can you hear me? My microphone should be on.
No, we can hear you, Jack.
You can?
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. All right, sorry. I've never used Zoom before, I must say. Right, I'm not sure if I've missed anything. I accidentally left the meeting for a minute. But during his tenure as Master of Balliol College, did he have any impact on the college and the university as a whole, on sort of the viewpoints of what research was coming out of the college?
No, not. He was very influential, but not in that way. I think everyone who talked about his teaching said that he didn't have a school and he supported people whose views were not Marxist. In fact, none of his most famous students were Marxists. So not in a very direct way, but I think he did influence, obviously, through his example and inspiration, a kind of ambition and range in understanding the 17th century. So his most famous student would be Keith Thomas, I think, who obviously ranged well beyond the S.R. Gardner and Puritan Revolution view of the 17th century. And Hill and Thomas is very grateful to Hill for his support. So I think academically his influence was more diffuse than sort of direct. But he was a force for progress. He was in favour of co-education. He was in favour of postgraduate education, of opening Oxford up to people who hadn't done their degrees in Oxford. And yeah, there's a chapter on him as a Master of Balliol where he was in general quite a progressive force, although he was having to balance that against the views of a solid wedge of relatively conservative thought in the college. So he had an influence in Oxford for sure, but it wasn't in producing a school of Marxists. And I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, thank you. Very good answer. Thank you.
Right, I think we've time just for a couple more questions, and then we really must let Michael off because it's been a considerable prolonged effort. Right, Steve Cushion.
Yeah, it's a long time since I've read the Christopher Hill, but when preparing for this, I did have a look through a lot of his easy available stuff and material, and I don't see much outside of the narrow confines, if you will, of England. Now, I mean, given that Cromwell's Western design, the conquest of Jamaica, was really, to me, very much the start of the British Empire. Had a disastrous effect on the Caribbean, disastrous effect on West Africa, and so on. I wonder why that aspect of it doesn't seem to have been much mentioned. And I've said this about Al Morton as well at a previous talk we had, that the Communist Party historians seem to be very kind of bound by England and not even, apart from Hobsbawm, and not even particularly concerned with the growing British Empire.
Yes, it's a puzzle. I agree. He wrote almost exclusively about England, and he wrote only Irish. The Irish stuff he wrote was about English views of Ireland, not about Ireland, and he didn't, I think, publish anything much about Scotland. And there's a paper in his archive which was never published about Scotland. So he did restrict himself to England, except for the book on Lenin and the Russian Revolution. It's funny because he says late on, you know, what's the next book in the 1980s? He said, well, there should be a book about race in Britain. You know, the Germans have confronted the Holocaust. We haven't confronted slavery. But it's a peculiar blind spot. He also saw the possibilities of women's history and of the history of sexuality, but didn't pursue them. So I think there is a thing about the party group in the 50s and its horizons, but there's a more general point about him that's interesting. And it's the more interesting because he clearly knew a lot about certainly European history. He read he read Russian, French, German. I think he read Italian. And he knew a lot of the history of continental Europe and taught the history of continental Europe, but he never felt, and he often, there's an implicit comparison, but I think it's because he's interested in the uniqueness of the first bourgeois society. I think it's not a Little Englanderism. It's a precision about what the question is, possibly, but it's a puzzle. I mean, his sympathies were internationalist, and throughout his life he was writing letters and taking up causes in Korea and Central Europe, and you know, I mean, he clearly was an internationalist, but he wrote very narrowly on England. I'm don't know quite how to explain it, but I think that's probably it. Not English Little Englanderism, but a English exceptionalism. There's something exceptional about the English 17th century, and that's the focus of my work.
Yes, that's interesting, but that's a position he came to slowly, because he began by objecting to the exceptionalism of the Whig view of England. And they rather had a conception that the progression through absolutism, then bourgeois revolution, was a common pattern. But he eventually had to discard that and got back to this exceptionalism. But of a different sort. Right, Christian, and you'll have to be the last question, Christian.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed a lot of the talk. I'm grateful for the fact it's recorded, so to go back on that. I studied uni in the late 90s, and Christopher Hill was on the curriculum, thanks to one David Parker, a historian who had set Christopher Hill on the revolutions course in the first year. And at Brighton Uni, where we do set Christopher Hill again, excellent essay on Hobbes and something like that. So he is, yeah, hopefully some students still have him. What you said about the English Civil War is quite interesting, about how today partly people try and remember it as a sort of tragic war, what a waste, nothing about the ideas. And that's very similar to the American Civil War in some ways, and some of the battles of the historiography around that, if you like, just more mislost, rather than look at the look at the potential around Black liberation and so on within that. But my point was just, about, I suppose, coming back to the Englishness question, I suppose partly it's to do probably with the Popular Front, in part, as the time he was trying to build. Popular Front saw that as a key thing in trying to wrest Englishness away from the far right, and that sort of battle on one level. Matt, that you had a quote right at the end about this Trevor Roper on the historians of that time, and saying how they went into the Communist Party on conscience and then left in 56 on conscience as well. I mean, it just doesn't seem quite right. If you're staying in the CP that long, you're obviously serious on one level about your Marxism. Otherwise, you'd have done like a W.H. Auden or something and left, or moved around from a lot earlier, flirted with it in the 30s, and then it seemed to me, so it doesn't quite ring right to me. But thank you for talking. Sorry, I missed a lot of it.
Yeah, thanks. I think just to clarify, I think leaving the party was not leaving Marxism for Hill, absolutely not. But he was reluctant to define his Marxism because it became a kind of polemical, political battle rather than an intellectual position, I think. So in the 80s, he habitually said, well, it depends what you mean by Marxist, because he didn't want to sign up to the policies of this or that Marxist party. But he clearly remained committed intellectually to Marxist analysis. That's absolutely true.